Okay, so welcome everyone to the third talk of the semester. So this talk is hosted by the Plurilingual Speaker Series Lab, as well as the BILD Belonging, Identity, Language and Diversity Research Group, as well as DISE Research Talks. So today we're very happy to welcome Dr. Woll and Dr. Pierre-Luc Paquet from Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. So today they will talk to us about how third language learners of French in Mexico and Spanish in Quebec constructed awareness of cross-linguistic correspondences during pedagogical sequences specifically designed for cross-linguistic reflections. So today, Dr. Woll and Dr. Paquet will have 1 hour for their talk, which will be video recorded, and the recording will be available on the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel in a couple of days. And this talk will be followed by a 30-minute discussion period that will not be video recorded so that everybody feels comfortable participating as much as they want. Today we're also going to take pictures, so if ever you're not comfortable with that, please make sure to let us know so that we don't post them or we don't take pictures of you. So the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you very much, Alexa. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting us. We're really excited. Thank you for the people who are watching, even if it's next week or any time, who are watching this out of interest, which is great. So we'll actually be presenting a project that has been launched already 2 years ago, and that is actually focused on pedagogical interventions, a series of pedagogical interventions that have been implemented in a number of foreign language classrooms, both in Quebec and in Mexico, and now lately also in the US. We'll be reporting only on the first phase of the project, so to the 2018 data, so only part of the preliminary data. But we will also make sure to elaborate on the investigations that are underway now and on what is to come after that, okay? So, yeah. Right, so I guess this speaks for itself. We will be following the general structure and start off with a little bit of background on ourselves. Great.
Okay, so in order for everyone to know a little bit where we come from and more specifically, where and when we started to have interest in cross-linguistic pedagogy and cross-linguistic influence, we will give a brief summary of who we are a little bit. Pierre-Luc Paquet, I'm actually from Quebec, so I know the context of Quebec in terms of second language teaching, and I can say that as a learner, it has always been very difficult for me to learn languages, and I learned English in an immersion context. In an immersion context, so when I started teaching, to teach using exclusively the target language was not a good way to do it, it was the only way, right? In terms of Explore, for example, where I worked as a French instructor, it was basically speaking French at all times for teachers and students. If not, you might be expelled or you might get consequences. So the use of other languages was prohibited.
So as for myself, I was born and bred in Germany, and I came from a different background. So for myself, both in my schooling and also in my training, I was trained to teach English and French as foreign languages in Germany, and then later also German over here. But for me, well, language classrooms will always, there were always different languages involved in the language classrooms, and there was no such target language only restriction. So both of us, we come from different backgrounds, and we put our forces together to work on this project.
Yeah, and we decided to meet and to enjoy the presence of each other, even though we had very different ways of looking at it.
Yeah.
So we met as we were working on our PhD. I was interested in cross-linguistic influence, but more specifically in the influence of L1 properties, so mostly in terms of cross-linguistic influence of the first language. And Nina was mostly, not mostly, but she was working in linguistic awareness and cross-linguistic
And
awareness.
L2, L3 transfer, so, yeah.
So that gives a little bit an overview of who we are and why we started being very encouraged and very interested in that field of work. But when it comes to multilingual practices, since both of us actually teach second languages or third languages at the moment, to actually try to implement different strategies and different multilingual strategies in our teaching became very important to us. But also, in order to be able to teach future teachers, or to be able to give them the proper argument to convince them that, hey, using other languages in the classroom can be beneficial.
Oh.
So basically, 2 years ago, just before we started this project, we went to the International Association of Multilingualism. And, well, this was food for thoughts. We observed a lot of different presentations, and all of these were showing us how important other languages and the coexistence of these languages were for language development or language identity, and for society in general. However, there's a question that remained unanswered a little bit in our mind. How should we do that? Should we use other languages as a vehicle? So basically using other languages as a mean of transportation of knowledge, as a mean of explaining something in the target language using the learner's first language, for example, or as a resource where we try to connect, contrast, compare languages and make or help learners make these connections that exist between languages. Or both, basically. Right? And the question that we will come back a little bit later is, with what specific goal exactly? Which we will leave it to later. Yeah.
All right.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So all of this basically comes from different construct in third language acquisition. And it is closely related to the project that we will present today, since basically we're saying as practitioners or as learners to be able to observe how we acquire a third language, not only the first one, but the third language is important. So the factor model basically that says that when we learn the first language, well, it's based on the experience we have and the input and amount, the type and amount of input we receive. And then when we acquire a second language, well, we develop all of these strategies, all of these cognitive factors that come with acquiring the second language, an affective factor as well that come into play, well, plays a high role. But when we acquire that third language, well, we should embrace all of that we already learned before, and all of these not competency, but strategies or factors are actually transferred to the acquisition of that third language and can be developed even more, and we can see it from a more precise or more conscious
perspective. And that is the additive view of multilingualism, basically.
Exactly.
So so all of these different approaches, one could say, they sort of come together in the sense that also focus on multilingualism is actually an approach, one could say, or also a project which looks at the whole linguistic repertoire of learners, which is, I mean, we're preaching to the converted, right? So all of us, so of multilingual learners who actually take all of the resources that they have to learn new languages, but also to learn more about the languages that they already have. And that reflects the dynamic model of multilingualism, in which cross-linguistic interaction is viewed as something that is not only dynamic, but also unpredictable. So cross-linguistic interaction works between all the languages that we know, and possibly in all different directions as well. So we also have to look, if we only look at means, we cannot see the complexity in what each individual learner might actually do with the different languages. So what this means for plurilingual education is actually summarized in the Common European Framework of Reference, where the plurilingual approach is sort of summarized as, or it has been made explicit here in this description of what plurilingual education is, of which the ultimate goal is, in fact, here as we can say it, communicative competence, to which all knowledge and experience of language contributes, and in which languages interrelate and interact. Okay, so that obviously, that can happen in all sorts of different contexts, right? So the Council of Europe has in fact been promoting this pluralistic perspective for over 20 years now. And there's like the European Council for Modern Languages has developed a framework of reference for the pluralistic approaches, the FREPA, CAVAP in French, which can be accessed online, and in which actually, or which is, so to speak, a valuable step or a possible way of implementing the Common European Framework of Reference, and more specifically, the intercultural and plurilingual competence, or how that competence could be spelled out. So this framework actually works with a series of descriptors, which works like with the CFR, which is in the 3 dimensions of savoir, savoir-faire, savoir-être. So if we just have these 3, so knowledge, skills, attitudes, and these are just 2 examples of descriptors that could describe, for example, the skills one can use knowledge and skills already mastered in one language, and activities of comprehension and production in another language, but also something like having confidence in one's own abilities, which is more the identity part of the learner, or the learner identity. Yeah. So there are, in fact, there are 4, let's say, 4 pedagogical approaches have been outlined in this framework, and this is all of this sort of rings a bell to all of you probably. Awakening of languages, or awakening to languages, sorry, éveil aux langues, is mostly concerned with openness, or fostering openness to linguistic diversities, especially with children. Whereas intercomprehension between related languages, well, we have, for example, Eurocom, German after English, or the Romance languages, where we have several curricula that have been designed for that. And the intercultural approach, which has also, which is, I guess, all of you are sort of globally aware, it has been around for a long time, but which focuses on the cultural aspects that underlie interpersonal communication, and that can actually help us understand each other in a multilingual world. And finally, the integrated didactic approach, which, well, actually the actual goal is more what we would call sort of the goal of traditional or language learning, but in a context where we actually draw on the different languages that we already have. So we bring prior knowledge to the language classroom. Now, on this side of the Atlantic, if we think about the multilingual turn, educational authorities may not have taken the turn as quickly, let's say, as in Europe, which can be explained by many sociological and political factors, but the translanguaging movement that all of you are familiar with, I guess, so the growing research community in the translanguaging movement has clearly made a case for pluralistic or plurilingual practices in all sorts of different contexts. And despite some differences between, let's say, the translanguaging movement and the pluralistic approaches that are promoted by the Council of Europe, which is mostly, the differences are mostly based in sort of the the prototypical learning contexts in which they originated, so where we have translanguaging, which is actually more focused in the beginning on bilingual education, and has now also been extended to other contexts, learning contexts, for example, migrant populations that would take, from linguistically diverse populations that would all get together in a classroom, but very little applications to actually, or in the literature, it's actually rather rare that the translanguaging literature will actually be related to foreign language education. So, or foreign language learning, regular foreign language teaching, let's say. So at the same time, these approaches, they're actually based on the same theoretical tenets, one could say, which is both Grosjean's and Cummins' work on bilingualism, but also the dynamic model of multilingualism. This is the common ground, one could say. What's interesting now is that actually whatever we call the approach, all of these different didactic approaches, or classroom approaches, are in fact at variance with the monolingual principle that is still promoted in both that we are looking at today. So, in fact, this is what also makes it clear for us that we actually looked in the since we are focusing on foreign language classrooms, we went and looked on the side of, or we will situate the project within the integrated didactic approach. And so we had to start looking for the material that already exists and see what is it that you do, right, in a classroom like that. So we'll just look at some examples, yeah.
So here basically we have two examples that we looked at from the Cavanagh or FREPA.
Yeah.
And there are many different examples, but one thing that was interesting to observe is that these examples come from the oldest student population, which was secondary 2 and older. And if we look at it very briefly, we see that in the example, they are actually using isolated sentences in order to foster those cross-linguistic connections between the different languages. And if we try to connect this with instructed SLA or instructed second, third additional language acquisition, well, we know that to receive meaningful input and to be able to observe the different structures in different contexts is very important. So that brings us back to with which specific, what is the goal of instruction? With which specific goal are we trying to develop or design these activities for? Which, if we look at language development, and the goal is to observe learning gains and retention, farther away in the project, well, we need to look at it from an instructed second language acquisition as well perspective. And without going back to the activity, without meaningful input and meaningful language in use, they can actually make cross-linguistic connection and they can become more cross-linguistically aware, but it is not going to provide them with enough meaningful input to acquire the language or develop that language.
So, oh man, this thing is just a bit finicky. Yeah, well, so we already briefly spoke about the monolingual bias, and one of the things that is very, that struck me personally when I started teaching future teachers in Quebec is that when we teach the Quebec education program, there is this very explicit policy of using only the target language. So what happens when students enter this program, not only have they received, they all have learning experiences, but then they also get told from the first day of school that you are a good teacher if you use English only, let's say. If it's English, I'm teaching future English teachers, but it's the same thing for Spanish or for French. So This is something that is specific to this context here, because the people who are actually taking these courses, these language courses, they have been in this environment, right? Yeah.
And in terms of the second context, where, well, it was in Mexico, and every single institution had their own policy in terms of target language use. And here, basically, in the institution where the study was carried out, we observed in that article from, professors from that institution that there are no policies in terms of which language you should use in the institution. However, all professors that participated in this study, they were saying, well, I was told that I need to use only the target language in class. And so there is an implicit, maybe not that explicit like the CAP, but there is an implicit policy stating that, hey, if you do your job well, you will use a target language at all times. And the last thing that I would mention is, based on the context of instruction, is that, as Nina said, the North American context is very different from the European context. And, well, if you learn German in Quebec, most of the exposure you will receive is going to be in the classroom setting. So basically, we try to maximize that exposure in order for them to develop the language, right? So there's that idea as well that brings an argument towards, well, we should use a target language. So the question that we asked before, which was, how can we use other languages in the classroom? Well, is major, is very important.
Yeah. All right. So briefly, the study, okay? So what we looked at, this is very broad, but we'll go in more detail in these research questions. So we, first of all, explored the perceived usefulness of cross-linguistic awareness-raising activities that aim at helping learners to make the connections between the target language and the other languages that they know. So this was this is the first and sort of common goal of the activity, which the first step was establish the activities. And this is the thing that is, or the tasks that is still underway and that we're working on consistently. So in this first phase, our first question was, how do the learners perceive the use of other languages in a LX, other language classroom? And also, what do the recordings, now CLT is not communicative language teaching, but sorry, yeah, we wanted to change that, but cross-linguistic tasks, yeah. So what do the cross-linguistic task recordings, because they were recorded as they were, we'll explain that later, as they were making sense in groups of target language structures, what do they suggest in terms of the learners' meta and cross-linguistic reflections as they were doing the tasks? So it was both their perceptions before and after, and also directly based on the activities that they'd just done. Okay. So for the, sorry, I have to turn around all the time because this thing just works. It's very close. Okay, so we'll look at the two contexts. So there were actually many more participants, but we'll look at one group of each context now. In the Mexican context, they were all beginning learners of French as an additional language. Now, okay, so they had Spanish as a first language and English as a second language, and in some cases also other languages such as Italian and German. And there were 6 male, 21 female. Continue. On the other hand, in the Quebec context, they were beginning Spanish learners. So both of them were very beginner courses in both of the languages. And so where in the Quebec context, the first language was French, second language English, and they had also some other language knowledge at the time. So they were very, as we usually have learners who know different languages to different degrees. All right, so again here it was a rather sort of diverse population in terms of ages as well. It's university language courses, anyone can sign up to them, right? All right.
Okay, so during that first phase of the project, all participants completed 3 different cross-linguistic tasks, CLT for today. And all activities except one, and we will talk about that one a little bit after, were designed the same way. So there was a...
Yep, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
There was... Okay. To you. There was an input-based activity to start the task, and then a cross or metalinguistic reflection on the targeted structure, of course, and then a validation phase. And since it was all new, we were piloting new ideas. There's one activity, this one, the pretexto perfecto and the determinant possessive, where we did not use a meaningful input. So in the input phase, there were isolated sentences as the ones we saw in Crepa, right? In Frepa, sorry, Carap. And what we observed and what we'll discuss afterwards is that the level of appreciation of these participants in terms of that activity was highly influenced by the fact that I didn't know what I was doing because the input was not providing me with enough information to figure it out, to be able to reflect actively on that targeted structure. So all activities that we'll talk about today are basically following that model here, and includes an input-based activity which is inspired. It doesn't follow all the criteria, but it is inspired by the structured input activity from Van Patten, where we focus only on one structure at a time, and we make learners do something meaningful with the task, and we make sure to try to isolate that targeted structure for the learners to need the structure in order to understand the core, or understand the idea behind the input they receive. And then the meta or cross-linguistic reflection, where they would be asked to do some simple translation, for example, from L1 to the target language, or from the target language to L1, or even to other languages, but really in the idea that during that task they would be able to make connections and observe different observe how the targeted structure works. And in the validation phase, it was basically bringing everyone back together, and the teacher, the collaborative teacher, would use that information. It was a little early.
Sorry, it was a little early, bad teacher. Okay,
sorry,
don't look at the sheets yet.
In the validation phase,
I thought we were there already, I'm sorry.
No, it's good.
Yeah, I anticipated this.
The teacher would... When I get interrupted, it's unbelievable how
So the teacher would sorry, okay,
yeah.
good.
Okay, so the teacher would guide learners towards the right hypothesis, or the right assumption on how the targeted structure worked. But it would be using the assumptions and hypotheses that they've created for themselves in small groups during the second task, and the teacher would actually guide them asking questions and not providing them with the actual answer. And now we will look at an example of a task, which I will try to be brief. But if we look at this activity, it's actually la forma progresiva, so the progressive form in Spanish, and you can see that the input is, well, meaningful. They need to do something with that input, and they need the progressive form in order to complete the task correctly. Because when they arrive with that first exercise here, with the amount of information that is provided to them, they cannot solve or be certain of the answer that they're giving.
It could fit with two.
It could fit with two. Here, for example, François Legault, we have Donald Trump as well. On the sheet, you can see it. Or Bruce Willis, I think it's Alec Baldwin. But anyway, they can have an idea, but they cannot be certain. And then that second input arrives, where we include the actual progressive form, that provides them with the information needed in order to complete the task. To be able to say who's who, based on which description. And just to give you an example, there would be, after, I'm on the other side now of the worksheet, and there would be a little activity where they would be able to use that input that they already looked at and to try to figure out how it works, or just to bring their thoughts in a more structured way, let's say. In order to go with that last question that is here.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't...
Where they actually look at the ressemblance entre la structure et les différentes langues connexes.
All right. So, sometimes it just won't.
It's okay.
Wow. Okay. So, the language course, the language courses. So, as we just said, there were both beginner courses in Spanish and in French. And what we did, in fact, to collect the data on the participants' perceptions of the activities. First of all, they were at the beginning of the term and at the end of the term, they were handed out questionnaires which would target the overall perceptions of good language teaching. It's a Likert scale questionnaire where at the end they would have one open question or a vignette in the second questionnaire. We could talk about that if you're interested. We're still working on them and we're improving them along the way, but basically it's a Likert scale questionnaire where you would say the teacher should always use the target language from 1 to 5, entirely agree and entirely disagree. And then we have the scale, and they would answer the same questions at the beginning and at the end of the term, and we would try and see if something happens. And then they would also, after each of the tasks throughout the semester, fill out a post-task questionnaire where they would be asked, what did you, first of all, they would rate on a Likert scale their level of agreement with this was beneficial for me, and then they would comment on what they liked, what they disliked, or what was useful and what was not so useful for them. And during the team discussion phase, they were audio recorded so that we could see what kinds of connections they would be making during this phase, and if they came up with hypotheses that were in fact based on cross-linguistic correspondences, basically. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so this is really just to go back to the previous slide and just say that we will look at the results from 2 different tasks, since we realized in that first phase the importance of that input, of having a meaningful input for them. However, in the comments that we're going to, we categorized and coded the different comments, and we decided to keep the comments from the second activity to see if they were representing what we thought, which is that input is actually really important, but we'll go back to this. So if we look at the appreciation of the activities themselves, Nina already mentioned the Likert scale and what they needed to complete. It was only one question. What do you see as useful, and what did you like and dislike from the task? And we can see here that, for example, it seems that the activities in French in Mexico were more appreciated than the ones that were completed in Quebec. However, in the following comments, we see a little bit better the reason why. For that activity, for example, the learner says, I prefer receiving explicit and more traditional explanations. So if we go back a little bit to what the learners experience in elementary school, high school, or what they're more comfortable with, they prefer to receive the information and then to do exercises. So it was not on the cross-linguistic reflection part that would lower a little bit their appreciation, but more on the discovery, on the inductive versus deductive approach to language teaching. If we look at 2 other comments quickly, we see here the participant said, the activity allowed me to learn more about Spanish. and also about French. So basically, this is an experience I had as a learner, which I found very interesting, and now I see it in our data, which makes it very interesting to see that, hey, when we learn a third language, it gives us opportunity to even better our knowledge of our first language, second language, or any other languages that we might learn in the future. And the other comment that I would like to mention, since I do not have high proficiency in Spanish, I could make the wrong assumption. So if we go back to, once again, the discovery, the inductive approach to teaching that we decided to use in the prototype, well, we see that they can be feeling outside of their comfort zone, but at the same time, well, the teacher is there and the learning community is there in order to solve these issues altogether. So the level of proficiency seems to be a factor, and then the fact that they might arrive at the end and say, okay, I was completely wrong. However, just to conclude, it seems though that even if they have a wrong assumption, just the fact that they're reflecting about the languages, when they get the right information, that reflection is already ongoing and it helps them to better their knowledge.
Okay, so what we try to do now is, in fact, is we actually try to, within the comments, we try to see what they liked in the task specifically, and came up with, we did a thematic analysis through the different comments in the post-task questionnaires, and came up with these 5 different categories in which we would say they appreciated cross-linguistic reflection. So when they would indicate that they learned something about the different languages by making correspondences. Some would talk about the things that they have learned more specifically. They would describe how it works, which we call metalinguistic development. Then people would talk about the inductive or learner-centered approach when they would say something like, for example, I'm not like that. I like to receive teachers' instructions first and then do my activities, which would be somebody who appreciated negatively the inductive learner-centered approach. Then collaborative learning, which was across the board and in both contexts only positively rated, where they would say, I really appreciated being able to discuss with peers and getting their point of view. It helped me. And then the appreciation of the input itself, where sometimes they would say, great, now I got it. I had just enough information, or I just didn't know what to look for, so I didn't have enough information. And what we can see here, yeah, thanks, is that, in fact, on the Quebec side, in blue, there were a lot more negative comments on the input, what Pierre-Luc already said before, because they were, they seemed to be more critical, or they seemed to be more lost when there was no structured input in the beginning and they didn't know what to look for. If you go for the other ones. So what we can see, however, is that overall there were lots more comments on the Mexican side that would actually explicitly talk about the comparison between languages as being useful, whereas on the Quebec side, that it was most of the time just implicit. We could just think that probably that's what they found useful for learning, but they didn't say explicitly very often that what they learned, or that they learned it based on the comparison. And then if we look at this more sort of classroom management, or no, not management, but how the teaching is given, in fact, or the pedagogical approach, let's say, we can also see here, and this is what Pierre-Luc already hinted at, is that on the Quebec side, the people seem to be more resistant to this inductive approach, where they had to come up with hypotheses without knowing where they were going. Whereas that seemed to be more overall, there seemed to be a positive perception of that on the Mexican side. All right, so now I will just give you, this is just, I know that this is a lot of stuff, I just wanted to show you this to give you an idea of what we did with the pre-post questionnaires. And as I said, there were several these were the appreciations of the tasks, okay? And these were 2 questions for, that would, okay, the 2 questions are in fact here, with 2 questions which would focus on the target language or the target language only perspective, one would say, where they would rate whether or not the teacher should use the target language only, or the teacher should push students to use the target language only at time 1 and time 2, time 1 and time 2. We put them in red here because that's the sort of the posture TL only, let's say. And on the other hand, we just looked at 2 questions. There were more. There were 6 in each category, but we just looked at the 2 here to just give a little overview. Where here they would be asked to rate whether they agreed that the first language should be used, or the first or other languages should be used, or probably in this case only the first language, leur langue maternelle, pour parler du fonctionnement de la langue cible. So language as a vehicle, as we say. So this is un atout là, ça m'aide. L'enseignant devrait permettre aux élèves de faire ça. Tandis que l'autre ici, c'est un atout que l'enseignant encourage les élèves à discuter des similarités et des différences. This is really more focused on this language as a resource, or where we actually come up with these different cross-linguistic connections. Ce qui est encadré ici, là, these are actually 8 participants that were student teachers. So I will talk about them just a little later, but they were grouped together here. What I tried to indicate with the blue and red, in fact, is interesting that in the beginning, when we gave these pre-post questionnaires, we thought, well, what we want to see is a movement from less flexible, because we were expecting that they would be a little target language only, to more flexible, right? Because they did all of these experiences that we anticipated would be appreciated, right? That's what we hoped. But what we can see, in fact, is that here in the blue and red, I just indicated 4 out of these 20 actually went to more flexible, but 7 went to more rigid, okay? So, I mean, these are Likert scale questions, okay? So we know that we can't actually go very far with these interpretations, but it's interesting that it actually does go both ways. Not always by 2 steps from not agreeing to agreeing, for example, but still, there are movements in both directions, which is interesting. So we'll look at some more specific profiles after that, but just so you get an idea of what we did. Okay, I think it's still, okay, sorry.
Okay, so just so you know.
I talk a lot.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
Just so you know, all profiles were divided in 4 categories. And when we talk about plus, for example, is someone that would be inclined to towards the target language only use in their classroom based on the 2 questions that Nina just presented. And the minus would be not that inclined to using other languages. And we can see here very
sorry, can I just jump in? I'm sorry, just to make it clear. Yeah, I'm sorry, I know, just very quickly, but we looked here at time 2. Okay, so we looked at the end, in both contexts, people who would, at time 2, be identified as being more towards maximal target language only use on the left, and inclined towards using other languages on the right. Okay, so this was only a time 2. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so hello again. But the thing that is important to mention is that the idea here is not for learners to get to a point that they say using the target language in the classroom is not a good thing. The idea is for them to open to the presence of other languages and to reflecting using other languages in the classroom. So if we look at the profile,
Yeah, sorry, I'll do it. Sorry.
If we look at the profiles here, these are the 2, and here the same thing. These are the 2 that we want to look at, where it seems that at the end of the project, they were seeing that using other languages in the classroom as something beneficial. But however, we have a lot of profiles that are plus, so they're inclined towards the use of the target language only, let's say. but they are also open to using other languages. And this is a very interesting profile because it seems that they have an idea that, look, we should use the target language as much as possible in class. However, let's not belittle the use of other languages in the classroom because it can be highly beneficial.
Yeah, so sorry for this walking around all the time. So what is interesting, as I said, in the Quebec context, is that we had 8 participants that were, 8 participants that were student teachers, and the interesting thing is that 7 out of these 8 participants were strongly inclined towards using the target language, so gave high ratings on, yes, students and teachers should use the target language all the time. So we're in this, and 6 of the 8 in the plus profile were student teachers, which is interesting in the sense that, well, as I said earlier, they were in their first term of the student teacher training program, where they had been told a lot that using the target language is the way to go. So, and on the other hand, they also seemed open, or at least at the end of the term, more open to plurilingual practices. And if we just look at this one example from one post-task comment from a student in this profile. As you can see, c'est très bon pour les gens autodidactes, trouver la règle en se basant aussi sur notre langue maternelle, la collaboration et le savoir de l'équipe, blah blah blah, bonne déduction, interesting, we're actually looking at induction, but whatever, un bon complément à l'activité magistrale, so it was a very positive comment. So overall, what we can actually, in the profile, however, what we saw is that, their very strong tendency to rate target language only as the way to go was what when I looked through the data, identified as sort of the brainwashing hypothesis. But at the same time, it can also be a good thing, right? So it's not only negative when you rate on a scale. Yes, the teacher should use the target language only, right? But on the other hand, we can and hope that to think that the language or the learning experience may have influenced their positive perception of using other languages. All right, so, and this is what we can see here. This was this example of this participant who went from not agreed to, well, just a little bit more inclined towards TL only use, but also more inclined to actually using other languages for both as a vehicle and as a resource. Okay.
As of an example from the Mexican side, I will talk about a participant that is minus plus here. Okay, and basically if you look at the different numbers that Nina showed for the Quebec participant, we can observe that that person was less inclined at the end of target language only. However, for the teacher. So it influenced in terms of the teacher using other languages, the target language only in the class. That's the one that dropped the result itself. But the student should be using the target language at least, well, every class, right? Or more, right? But if we look at the comment that is mentioned, it's a comment that is actually saying that the activity helped that person to reflect on the French language, but also to learn better the Spanish language, which is his L1. We will look at 2 different transcription very quick inside. Here it would be using other languages as a vehicle, and we can see that they are using different meta-language or terminology. They're not always very precise. For example, here it would be more mentioning demonstrative pronoun, but he's talking or she's talking about possessive, but at the same time you see that there is a reflection going and they're getting to some sort of assumption that are of interest for them to develop the knowledge. But if we look at the second one, it would be to use other languages as a resource and as a vehicle. So there's a conversation here in line with the difference between c'est and il est. And here, all of a sudden, basically in the conversation, the student arrive and said, yeah, but this is like in English, right? If we say this or that. So here he's using, or she's using, the student is using Spanish in order, as a vehicle to reflect on il est and c'est, but using English as a resource in order to connect it to what they already know.
And if we just look very quickly at one of the examples here from the Quebec side, we also see that the language, it's a little bit the same thing as Pierre-Luc just said, but by indicating here, so they were talking about the, we talked about the estar plus gerundio, which is basically very close to the English. He is, I am going, the ing form. And it's interesting here that we have actually very different kinds of ways of treating the structure in these two students. For example, where one would say, ah, le passé composé en français, mais c'est pas la même utilisation. They were looking at the form, which is this composed form, whereas this other person actually talks about the underlying structure. Ça correspond mieux à l'anglais, en fait. And what we're now looking at more in the new data, we're trying to come up with sort of a coding system where we can try and identify how many people actually use grammatical terminology, and if that aligns, because it often actually doesn't necessarily align with the correct underlying assumptions of the structures. You don't necessarily need to say passé composé, gérondif to know how this works. So, and this is often one of these things about metalinguistic awareness, right, where we often apply it to sort of knowing the words, which is not everything. So this was just an interesting comment also from them, finding out how it works. Yeah.
Let's
right.
go back to...
All right, so overall, yeah, c'est moi. So, okay. So how do learners perceive the use of other languages in the language classroom? We have several observations. So on the one hand, students did express concerns, but what we also said, for example, is that this was often related to this inductive approach to language teaching. But even though there seemed to be some resistance, especially on the Quebec side, many of them, however, did come up with correct hypotheses. So it's not because they were resistant necessarily that they didn't actually learn something or appear to learn something from this kind of interaction. And also, yeah, teacher presence and role in the classroom contexts, which are definitely influence their perception of these activities. So it's not only the cross-linguistic part of it that they're actually thinking of when they're rating their appreciation. Yes, and most of them also acknowledge the benefits of these differences and similarities, as we already said. This is basically a summary, and importantly, engagement in one's own learning and collaborative learning was something that came up all of the time, which is something that we actually hadn't thought that this would be the thing that they would go, yes, finally we can actually discuss with other people how things work.
In terms of the second research question, what do the recordings suggest in terms of learners' meta and cross-linguistic reflection? Well, as they completed the task, in a general sense, all teams arrived to partially correct or correct assumption of the targeted structure. Sometimes they would go from one idea that is completely out of it, but they would always come back to something that is manageable. So the activity itself was allowing them to reflect on the language and the structure of the activity to get to a general idea of what it is, and the validation phase would just bring all of this information together for them for partial correct assumption to become understood, or the right assumption. The task allowed for, that's just what I just said, and that was a good thing that actually, because we observed in the transcription, but it's only 3 examples we showed today, that the tasks themselves were allowing students to activate their linguistic repertoire in order to make these connections. And their level of engagement that we mentioned before, that if we go back to the connection, and you can move to the other slide.
Great.
We go back to the connection, that needs to be made between ISLA or SLA second language as any other language after the first one, acquisition, and plurilingualism, well, we know that for the language to be developed, meaningful input and meaningful language in use is very important. So since we saw that high level of engagement in the learners, in the input but in the task itself, since we saw that all learners were effectively and cognitively involved in the activity, since we also saw that the learners were pushed towards observing the language structure, so to focus a little bit more on forms, well, it shows in a way that the task itself it suggests that the task itself can help for the language to be developed to a certain extent, but this is what we would love to be able to measure at some point for sure. So what now? Basically, there are many things we need to do. For example, to continue to observe the potential benefit of that. Right now we are developing activities and a precise prototype in German classes in Quebec and in French classes in the United States, and remodel the sequence into a more sustainable teaching model is actually what we will show you on the next slide. Train future teachers. We are working in collaboration with a colleague from the UQTR, and inside a given course, students are creating cross-linguistic tasks or cross-linguistic communicative task, and we are talking to them in order to make sure that they are reflecting on it and they can actually tell us what they think about it and reflect on the plausibility and the possible implementation of such a task, so in order to break a little bit that barrier that exists in terms of the target language only use, and open a dialogue with teachers, which depends on finance, but we plan to we plan to train second language teachers in both of our actual context in order for them to implement the prototype in their classrooms, and then to observe if it goes well and maybe go to school boards or anything. But the thing is, we need to talk about these issues, and this is what we aim to do.
Yeah. So what we in fact, and this is where we're at now. We're working, or we have started working, and this is the last slide. We have started working on a developmental study, recherche développement, which is something that we're both new to. We're working with a PhD student from Montreal, we work together on this cross-linguistic communicative task sequence, which we have started through this iterative process of sort of trying out things and then trying with different expert groups to see how these different theoretical but also practical implications or things that we have observed, how we can adapt the tasks. And so far what we have come up with is this sequence, let's say a pedagogical sequence of a modèle translinguistique communicatif, in which we have a sequence of 2 tasks, the first of which is a cross-linguistic, is a CRT, a consciousness-raising task. Like, so we're here in this task-based it's sort of bringing together plurilingualism and task-based language teaching, basically. So we have a first task that's a cross-linguistic awareness-raising task, which resembles a lot what we just saw in the first activities that we just presented, with pre-task, main task, and post-task. And then that would be followed by a communicative task in which students would actually apply the specific targeted structures in a communicative setting, which we now did in a sort of a play, jeu communicatif, and where we would also have a pre-task, a main task, and a post-task, and we would have une postage séquence that would go back on the whole sequence, and here all of the post-task questionnaires and the things that we're looking at are much more focused on all of the different aspects that we want to look at in terms of what they appreciated. Was it le retour en grand groupe qui a été le plus bénéfique pour moi? What were the aspects that was it to win the game that I want? So we're trying to look at the different aspects of how that was appreciated in a more systematic way now in this project. And yeah, we have the first data is coming out, and we're going to present it if Serbal is not cancelled in May, which it may be, but we will start presenting these and then try to train teachers and help people sort of spread the word.
And in a more, well, in the long run, to find a way to observe learning gains, which would be which would be very important.